You ever get that quiet sense of relief when plans get cancelled? Not disappointment, not even hesitation, just that subtle, almost guilty feeling of good, now I can finally breathe. If that sounds familiar, then stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why that feeling exists, and more importantly, why it might not be what people think it is. There's always that one person everyone talks about. The one who says maybe next time more often than yes. The one who suddenly isn't feeling well when the weekend rolls around. The one who disappears into their own space while everyone else is chasing noise. Sometimes it's a friend. Sometimes it's someone in your family. And sometimes it's you. And if you've ever chosen your favorite spot at home over a crowded room full of people, if you've ever picked comfort over chaos without feeling like you're missing out, then this isn't just a topic. This is a mirror. Because what most people call boring or antisocial has a deeper explanation, one rooted in psychology, biology, and something much more personal than most people realize. At the core of it all is something simple but powerful. Not everyone experiences energy the same way. Some people walk into a room full of conversation and feel more alive with every passing moment. Others walk into that same room and feel their energy slowly drain, like a battery being used faster than it can recharge. This isn't about attitude, it isn't about effort, it's about wiring. There's a concept in psychology called optimal arousal theory, and it explains why different people need different levels of stimulation to feel right. For some, silence feels empty. For others, it feels like peace. For some, constant activity is energizing. For others, it's overwhelming. If you're someone who loves staying at home, chances are your mind and body simply don't crave high levels of stimulation. You don't need constant interaction to feel fulfilled. In fact, too much of it can leave you feeling exhausted in a way that's hard to explain to people who don't experience it. Think about it like this. Imagine your energy as a battery. For some people, social interaction is the charger. The more they're around others, the more energized they feel. But for others, social interaction is the drain. Every conversation, every expectation, every moment of being on slowly depletes that battery. And home? Home is the charger that actually works. But it doesn't stop there. Because for a lot of people, the love of staying home goes beyond just introversion. It's not only about energy, it's about control. Outside, everything is unpredictable. Plans change. People behave in ways you don't expect. Conversations go in directions you didn't prepare for. There's noise, pressure, and that subtle feeling of needing to perform, to respond the right way, to say the right thing, to keep up. At home, none of that exists. At home, you decide everything. The lighting, the sounds, the pace. You can pause, rewind, step away, or sit in complete silence without needing to explain yourself to anyone. For someone who feels overwhelmed by unpredictability, that level of control isn't just comforting, it's grounding. And for people who experience anxiety or heightened sensitivity, that controlled environment becomes even more important. It's not about avoiding life, it's about creating a space where your mind can finally settle. What's interesting is that this preference for solitude isn't a weakness. In many ways, it's linked to strengths that often go unnoticed. People who genuinely enjoy being alone tend to have richer inner worlds. They think more deeply. They process things more thoroughly. They're often more creative, not because they're trying to be, but because they spend more time in reflection. When you're constantly surrounded by noise, there's very little room to hear your own thoughts. But when you step away from that noise, something shifts. Ideas form more clearly. Patterns become easier to notice. Problems start to unravel in ways they didn't before. There's even evidence suggesting that people who are comfortable with solitude tend to be better at problem solving. They're less reactive and more thoughtful. They don't rush decisions just to keep up with others. They sit with things. They observe. They analyze. In a world that celebrates speed and constant movement, that kind of stillness can feel out of place. But historically, it's been incredibly valuable. Early humans who paid attention to subtle details, who thought before acting, who didn't constantly seek stimulation, they had an advantage. They noticed changes others missed. They avoided risks others rushed into. In a strange way, the same traits that make someone prefer staying home today are connected to survival instincts that have existed for thousands of years. But modern society doesn't always frame it that way. Instead, there's this constant narrative that being out there, being social, visible, and active is the only way to live fully. Social media amplifies it. You see highlights of people traveling, partying, always doing something. There's this pressure to match that energy, to prove that you're living your best life. And if your version of a perfect evening doesn't look like that, it can feel like you're doing something wrong. But here's the truth that doesn't get said enough. Enjoying a quiet night at home doesn't mean your life is smaller. It means your preferences are different. If your idea of a good time is a familiar show, a warm drink and no obligations pulling at you, that's not a lesser experience. It's just one that isn't constantly broadcast. There's a kind of peace in choosing stillness over stimulation, a kind of clarity in knowing what actually fulfills you instead of chasing what looks good to others. That being said, not every reason for staying home comes from a place of peace. For some people, home becomes more than just a preference. It becomes a shield. Social anxiety can make even simple interactions feel overwhelming. Past experiences, whether it's rejection, embarrassment, or something deeper, can leave lasting impressions that make the outside world feel unpredictable or unsafe. And then there's depression, which doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up as a quiet lack of motivation, a feeling that nothing out there is worth the effort. A subtle voice that says, "Why bother?" In those moments, staying home isn't always about comfort. Sometimes it's about avoidance. And the line between the two, between choosing solitude and hiding in it, can be difficult to see. For many people, this pattern starts early. If you grew up in a loud or chaotic environment, you might have learned that silence equals safety, that being alone is the only way to feel calm. If your surroundings were unpredictable, you may have developed a strong need to control your environment as a way to cope. So you created your own space, your own routines, your own version of calm. And over time, that space became more than just a place. It became a habit, a comfort zone, a retreat you return to whenever the outside world feels like too much. The question isn't whether staying home is good or bad. The question is why. Does it leave you feeling restored, or does it leave you feeling stuck? There's a difference between choosing solitude because it fulfills you and defaulting to it because everything else feels too heavy. But for those who truly love staying at home, who feel energized by it rather than drained, it's a completely different experience. They don't feel like they're missing out. They're not sitting there wishing they were somewhere else. They're present, engaged in their own way. They find meaning in small things, the way their morning routine unfolds, the comfort of familiar surroundings, the subtle details most people overlook. There's a kind of richness in that simplicity. When your environment isn't constantly changing, you start to notice things more deeply. The way light moves through a room at different times of day, the way certain activities shift your mood, the patterns in your own thoughts. It's a quieter kind of awareness, but it's powerful. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as a low stimulation preference. It means you don't need constant external input to feel satisfied. Your mind creates enough engagement on its own. And when that's the case, silence doesn't feel empty. It feels full. So if you're someone who turns down invitations without feeling guilty, who enjoys spending time alone, who doesn't feel the need to constantly seek out new experiences just to feel fulfilled, you're not broken. You're not behind. You're not missing out on something everyone else understands. You're simply wired in a way that values depth over noise. And that doesn't need fixing. The only thing that matters is whether your choices are giving you what you actually need. If staying home brings you peace, clarity, and a sense of balance, then it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But if it starts to feel like a barrier instead of a refuge, then it might be worth asking yourself what's underneath that. Because the goal isn't to force yourself into a version of life that doesn't fit you. It's to understand yourself well enough to know the difference between comfort and avoidance. And once you see that clearly, everything else starts to make a lot more sense. So the next time you find yourself choosing your own space over everything else, don't rush to label it. Don't assume it means something negative. Sometimes it just means you know exactly where you feel most like yourself.